On a sweltering June morning in the year 2000, in a hamlet so small it barely registered on most Mississippi maps, a woman vanished. Her name was Clarissa Mae Thompson, 32 years old, mother of two, wife of a respected deacon at New Hope Baptist Church. She disappeared from her own kitchen while biscuits cooled on the counter and her coffee sat half-finished in a chipped ceramic mug decorated with yellow daisies. The screen door was unlatched. Her purse remained on the counter. Her car keys hung on the hook by the refrigerator. By nightfall, when the fireflies began their slow dance over the cotton fields and the heat had barely broken, every soul in Tallahatchie County knew something terrible had happened. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that the truth would hide in plain sight for nearly 2 decades, protected by silence, by loyalty, by the simple human inability to believe that evil could wear such a familiar face. The question that would haunt this Delta community for years was not whether Clarissa Thompson was dead. It was who among them had been living a lie all along. Tallahatchie County sits in the heart of the Mississippi Delta, where the land spreads flat and endless, interrupted only by the occasional stand of cottonwood trees and the skeletal remains of sharecropper shacks slowly being reclaimed by kudzu. In the summer of 2000, Glenwood, population 843, was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the First Baptist and the New Hope Baptist competed for congregants, where Friday night football at the high school was the only entertainment for miles. The poverty rate hovered near 40%. Most families survived on a patchwork of farm work, disability checks, and prayer. The Thompson family lived on County Road 19, a 2-lane blacktop that cut through soybean fields and eventually dead-ended at the Tallahatchie River. Their house was a modest brick ranch, built in the 70s, with a carport and a small front yard where Clarissa kept a garden of tomatoes and okra. Her husband, Reverend Marcus Thompson, was 40 years old, a tall man with careful eyes and a voice that could fill a sanctuary. He worked at the John Deere dealership in Charleston during the week and preached on Sundays. Their children, Keisha, 9, and Marcus Jr., 6, attended Glenwood Elementary, where the building still had asbestos tiles and the playground equipment had been painted over so many times you could see rust bleeding through. Those who knew Clarissa said she was quiet, dependable, the kind of woman who brought casseroles to shut-ins and organized the church bake sale every spring. She worked part-time at the county clerk's office, filing paperwork, answering phones. She wore her hair in a neat bun. She favored floral print dresses and sensible shoes. On Sunday mornings, she sat in the third pew from the front, left side, same seat every week, her children pressed close on either side. The morning of June 14, 2000 began like any other. The sun rose before 6, already burning the dew off the soybeans. Marcus Thompson woke at 5:30, showered, dressed in his work clothes, khaki pants and a button-down shirt with his name embroidered over the pocket. Clarissa made breakfast, scrambled eggs, biscuits, bacon. The children ate in front of the television, watching cartoons with the volume low. At 6:45, Marcus kissed his wife on the cheek, told her he'd be home by 5:30, and drove his F-150 north toward Charleston. The odometer would later show he drove exactly 32 miles that day, round trip. Clarissa walked the children to the end of the driveway at 7:15 to meet the school bus. Mrs. Geneva Howard, who lived across the road, saw them standing there. She waved. Clarissa waved back. Keisha wore a purple shirt. Marcus Jr. had on his favorite sneakers, the ones with lights in the heels. The bus arrived at 7:19. The children climbed aboard. Clarissa stood in the driveway, watching the bus disappear around the bend where the pavement turned to gravel. Mrs. Howard would later tell deputies that Clarissa lingered there for a moment, one hand raised to shield her eyes from the sun, before turning back toward the house. At 8:07, Clarissa clocked in at the county clerk's office. Her supervisor, Miss Dorothy Perkins, remembered because Clarissa was usually 5 minutes early, but that morning she'd been rushing. She seemed distracted, Miss Perkins would later recall. Kept checking her watch. Clarissa worked until noon, processing property deeds and answering questions about voter registration. At 12:15, she told Miss Perkins she wasn't feeling well, said she had a headache, and asked if she could leave early. Miss Perkins agreed. Clarissa clocked out at 12:18 and drove home in her 1994 Honda Accord, light blue, with a dent in the rear bumper. That was the last time anyone outside the Thompson home saw Clarissa Mae Thompson alive. Clear's throat when Marcus Jr. and Keisha stepped off the school bus at 3:45 that afternoon. The house was quiet. Too quiet. The screen door hung open, tapping gently against the frame in the breeze. Marcus Jr. ran ahead, calling for his mother. Keisha followed more slowly, her backpack dragging on the ground. Inside, the kitchen smelled of sugar and flour. 8 biscuits sat cooling on a wire rack on the counter. A coffee mug, still half full, sat beside the sink. The television in the living room was on, tuned to a soap opera, the volume turned down low. Clarissa's purse rested on the kitchen table, her wallet inside, $43 in cash still tucked in the billfold. Her car keys dangled from the hook by the refrigerator. The children called for their mother. They checked the bedrooms, the bathroom, the small back porch where Clarissa sometimes sat shelling peas. Nothing. Marcus Jr. began to cry. Keisha walked back through the house, slower now, noticing things. Her mother's glasses on the coffee table. Her Bible on the arm of the sofa, open to Psalms. The back door locked from the inside. At 4:15, Keisha called her father at work. Marcus Thompson arrived home at 4:53. He searched the house again, faster this time, calling his wife's name. He checked the carport, the tool shed, walked out into the garden where the tomatoes hung heavy on their stakes. He called Clarissa's sister in Memphis. He called the neighbors. No one had seen her. At 5:37, Marcus Thompson dialed 911. Tallahatchie County Sheriff's Department dispatched Deputy James Whitfield and Deputy Angela Morrison. They arrived at 6:04, just as the long summer light began to soften. They took statements from Marcus, from the children, from Mrs. Howard across the road. They walked through the house, noting the unlocked screen door, the coffee, the biscuits. Deputy Morrison photographed everything with a Polaroid camera. Deputy Whitfield radioed for additional units. By 7 o'clock, a dozen volunteers had gathered in the Thompsons' front yard. They organized search parties, groups of 4 or 5, armed with flashlights and walkie-talkies. They combed the fields surrounding the house, calling Clarissa's name into the gathering dusk. They checked the roadside ditches. They walked the half-mile to the river, where the water ran slow and brown, thick with sediment. The temperature had dropped to 85 degrees, but the humidity made every breath feel like swallowing wet cotton. At 9:30, Sheriff Raymond Polk arrived personally. He was a man of 62, pot-bellied and silver-haired, who'd been sheriff for 26 years. He knew the Thompson family. He'd attended services at New Hope Baptist. He pulled Marcus aside, away from the volunteers, and asked him questions in a low voice. How had Clarissa seemed lately? Had they been arguing? Were there money problems? Marcus answered each question with increasing agitation. No, there had been no arguments, no money problems. Clarissa had been fine that morning, perfectly normal. Sheriff Polk nodded, made notes in a small spiral notebook. The search continued through the night. Volunteers brought thermoses of coffee and bug spray. They set up battery-powered lanterns. They searched in widening circles, pushing through waist-high soybeans, their clothes soaked with sweat despite the darkness. The children were sent to stay with Marcus's mother in town. At 2 in the morning, with nothing found, Sheriff Polk called off the search until daybreak. The swing hung still in the backyard. The toy truck lay on its side in the grass. The investigation at first light on June 15, the search resumed with renewed urgency. The Mississippi Highway Patrol sent 2 additional units. The State Volunteer Search and Rescue Team arrived from Jackson with cadaver dogs and GPS equipment. The temperature climbed toward 95 degrees. The dogs worked in shifts, handlers rotating them every 30 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion. They swept the fields, the tree lines, the banks of Tallahatchie River. The dogs alerted twice, once near a culvert behind the house, once at the edge of the soybean field, but both turned out to be dead animals. A raccoon, a feral cat. The media arrived by midday. A reporter from the Clarion Ledger, a camera crew from WLBT in Jackson. They filmed the volunteers searching, interviewed neighbors, recorded footage of the Thompson house with its yellow crime scene tape strung across the front porch. By evening, Clarissa's photograph appeared on the 6 o'clock news. A church directory picture from 2 years earlier, her smile tentative, her eyes looking somewhere just past the camera. Deputies canvassed the area methodically. They knocked on every door within a 3-mile radius. They interviewed the mail carrier, who delivered a package to the Thompson house at 11:30 that morning and remembered seeing Clarissa's car in the driveway. They talked to the UPS driver, who'd driven past at 1:15 but hadn't stopped. They pulled security footage from the Piggly Wiggly in town, looking for Clarissa's car. Nothing. She hadn't gone to the grocery store. She hadn't stopped for gas. She had driven straight home from work and then simply vanished. Those who knew Marcus Thompson, and that was nearly everyone in Glenwood, said he was devastated. He barely spoke. He didn't eat. He spent hours sitting on the front porch, staring out at the road as if willing his wife to appear. But deputies whispered quietly among themselves about small things that didn't add up. His demeanor was odd, grief-stricken, yes, but also strangely composed, controlled. He didn't weep. He didn't rage. He answered questions in complete sentences, his hands folded in his lap, his voice steady. On June 17, 3 days after Clarissa's disappearance, Detective Marvin Hughes from the Mississippi Bureau of Investigation arrived to coordinate the case. He was a methodical man, 38 years old, with a reputation for solving difficult cases through sheer persistence. He set up a command post in the Glenwood Town Hall and began reconstructing Clarissa's final day minute by minute. The timeline was straightforward until it wasn't. Clarissa had left work at 12:18. The drive from the clerk's office to her home took exactly 11 minutes. Detective Hughes drove it himself twice, timing it both ways. That put her arrival at the house at approximately 12:30. The mail carrier saw her car at 11:30, but he'd been early on his route that day, so that didn't help narrow things down. The UPS driver passed at 1:15 and saw no signs of disturbance. That gave them a window. Sometime between 12:30 and 1:15, Clarissa Thompson had vanished. Detective Hughes interviewed Marcus again, this time at the sheriff's office. The interview lasted 4 hours. Marcus's story remained consistent. He'd been at work all day. He'd clocked in at 7:08. He'd clocked out at 4:43. His coworkers confirmed seeing him throughout the day, in the parts department, in the break room at lunch, at the service counter helping a customer around 2 o'clock. The dealership was 32 miles from the house, a 40-minute drive each way. There was no way Marcus could have driven home, done something to his wife, and returned to work without being noticed. Clear's throat, but Detective Hughes kept digging. He obtained Marcus's cell phone records. In the year 2000, cell phones were just becoming common, and Marcus carried a Nokia for work emergencies. The records showed 7 calls on June 14. 3 were to customers about tractor parts. 2 were to the house phone, both going unanswered. 1 was to Clarissa's sister in Memphis at Fort Wentty 1, and 1 was to a number Detective Hughes didn't recognize. A call placed at 12:47, lasting 6 minutes. The number belonged to a payphone outside the Texaco station on Highway 32, exactly 2 miles from the Thompson house. Detective Hughes drove to the Texaco. He pulled surveillance footage from the station. The video quality was poor, grainy black and white. But at 12:44, a pickup truck matching the description of Marcus Thompson's F-150 pulled into the parking lot. A man tall, wearing work clothes, got out and used the payphone. The camera angle didn't capture his face. At 12:51, the truck left. When confronted with this evidence, Marcus hesitated for the first time. Then he explained. He'd left work briefly to run to the hardware store for a part the dealership didn't have in stock. The hardware store was closed. He'd forgotten it shut down at noon on Wednesdays. He'd called home from the payphone to tell Clarissa he'd be late, but she hadn't answered. Then he'd returned to work. Simple as that. Detective Hughes checked the odometer on Marcus's truck. The vehicle had traveled exactly 32 miles on June 14, the exact round-trip distance between the dealership and the house. If Marcus had made an additional detour to the Texaco, to the hardware store, the odometer should have shown at least 50 or 60 miles. But it didn't. The investigation pivoted. Police obtained a search warrant for the Thompson home. They brought in forensic technicians from Jackson. They sprayed luminol in the bathroom, the bedroom, the kitchen. They found no blood. They tore up sections of carpet. Nothing. They searched the carport, the tool shed, the garden. They drained the septic tank. They brought in ground-penetrating radar and scanned the entire property. No sign of a body. No physical evidence of violence. It was as if Clarissa Thompson had simply evaporated. Marcus Thompson hired a lawyer on June 23. He stopped cooperating with police. He moved his children to his mother's house and rarely left the property. Reporters camped outside his workplace. The congregation at New Hope Baptist split into factions, those who believed Marcus was a grieving husband, and those who believed something far darker. By August, with no body and no concrete evidence, the investigation stalled. Detective Hughes returned to Jackson. The volunteers stopped searching. The news cameras left. The case went cold. Clarissa Mae Thompson was officially listed as a missing person, her status suspended in legal limbo. Her bank accounts remained open. Her driver's license remained valid. Her name stayed on the utility bills. The house on County Road 19 stood empty, a for-rent sign appearing in the yard that September. The swing hung still. The biscuits had long since been thrown away. The silence for those who have ever doubted someone you love, truly doubted them, felt that cold finger of suspicion tracing down your spine. You understand the particular prison it creates. You cannot speak the doubt aloud without destroying everything. But you cannot unsee what you've seen, unhear what you've heard, unfeel what you know in your bones to be true. Keisha Thompson was 9 years old when her mother disappeared. She was 27 when she finally spoke the truth. In the months after Clarissa vanished, Marcus moved the children into his mother's house on Cypress Street in Glenwood. The house was small, crowded, filled with the smell of menthol cigarettes and pine sol. Marcus Jr. slept on a cot in the hallway. Keisha shared a bedroom with her grandmother, who snored and kept the television on all night, volume low, casting blue shadows across the walls. Marcus worked during the day and spent evenings at the house on County Road 19, going through Clarissa's things, he said, looking for clues. Keisha stopped speaking for 3 months. She answered questions with nods or shakes of her head. Her teachers at school sent notes home expressing concern. A school counselor tried to talk with her, but Keisha sat silent, picking at a thread on her skirt, her eyes fixed on the floor. At night, she wet the bed. She was 9 years old and she wet the bed like a toddler, and her grandmother washed the sheets without comment every morning, hanging them on the line behind the house where everyone could see. Marcus Jr., only 6, seemed to adapt more easily. He played with his toy cars. He watched cartoons. He asked when Mama was coming home, and when no one answered, he stopped asking. But he developed a habit of drawing the same picture over and over. A stick-figure house with a stick-figure woman standing in the doorway, her arms raised, her mouth a straight line. By Christmas 2000, a routine had settled over the family. A grim, joyless routine, but a routine nonetheless. Marcus gave up the rental house on County Road 19. He stopped attending church. He worked long hours at the dealership, coming home after dark, eating dinner in silence, falling asleep in front of the television. His mother raised the children. She cooked their meals, helped with homework, braided Keisha's hair every Sunday evening for the week ahead. In January 2001, Marcus started dating again. A woman named Brenda Sykes, who worked at the Sonic in Charleston. She was younger than Clarissa by 8 years, with frosted highlights and long acrylic nails. She laughed loudly. She wore too much perfume. The children hated her. Brenda tried. She brought happy meals. She complimented Keisha's drawings. She let Marcus Jr. pick the radio station in her car. But the children remained cold, distant. Keisha, in particular, watched Brenda with dark, unblinking eyes that made the woman uncomfortable. In March 2002, nearly 2 years after Clarissa's disappearance, Marcus married Brenda at the courthouse in Charleston. Only his mother and brother attended. The children were told after the ceremony was over. That night, lying in the dark of her grandmother's room, Keisha whispered the first words she'd spoken voluntarily in months. "He did it." Her grandmother pretended not to hear. Clear's throat. The family moved into a new house, a rental on the south side of Glenwood, a brick duplex with thin walls and a yard that flooded when it rained. Marcus Jr. got his own bedroom for the first time. Keisha shared a room with her new stepmother's daughter from a previous relationship, a sullen teenager named Crystal who ignored her completely. The marriage was difficult from the start. Marcus worked constantly. Brenda complained about money, about the children, about living in a town where everyone still whispered about the first wife. Arguments erupted late at night, voices rising and falling through the walls. Keisha, now 11, began writing in a diary. She wrote about her mother in present tense, as if Clarissa might still be alive somewhere, waiting. She wrote about her father's new wife, cataloging every slight and cruelty. She wrote about the day her mother disappeared, the details that wouldn't leave her mind no matter how hard she tried to forget. The biscuits on the counter, the coffee cup by the sink, the way her father had searched the house that evening, his movements frantic but somehow performative, as if he were acting out the role of a worried husband rather than being one. She wrote about other things too, things she'd been too young to understand at the time, but which now, looking back, seemed to glow with terrible significance. The arguments between her parents in the weeks before Clarissa vanished, quiet arguments, tense, conducted in hissed whispers after the children had gone to bed. The way her father had started coming home late from work, smelling of beer and cigarette smoke. The phone call Keisha had overheard 3 nights before her mother disappeared, Marcus speaking in a low voice in the carport. "I can't do this anymore. Something has to change." In September 2003, Brenda left. She packed her things while Marcus was at work, loaded everything into a U-Haul, and drove to her sister's place in Memphis. She left a note on the kitchen table. "I can't live with a ghost." Marcus crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. He never spoke of Brenda again. The children moved back into their grandmother's house. Keisha was 13 now, Marcus Jr. 10. They attended Glenwood Junior High, where their classmates knew exactly who they were, the kids whose mother disappeared, whose father everyone suspected. They ate lunch alone. They walked home together in silence. Keisha's diary grew thicker, filled with pages of dense handwriting, questions circling back on themselves. Where did she go? Did he hurt her? Why won't anyone believe me? When Keisha turned 16, she got a job at the Piggly Wiggly bagging groceries and stocking shelves. She saved every penny. She barely spoke to her father, who had become a ghost himself, thin, gray-faced, working and sleeping and nothing else. Marcus Jr. had started getting into trouble at school. Small things at first, skipping class, talking back to teachers, but escalating. By the time he was 15, he'd been suspended twice for fighting. The family was fracturing, each member drifting into their own isolated orbit of grief and suspicion and unspoken rage. If you have noticed how families can live in the same house, eat at the same table, and yet exist in entirely separate realities, then you understand what the Thompson household had become. They moved around each other like chess pieces, careful never to touch, never to speak the words that might finally shatter the fragile pretense holding them together. But silence, like water behind a dam, builds pressure, and eventually something gives. The revelation on April 3, 2018, Clarissa Thompson Daniels, now 27 years old, married, living in Tupelo with her husband and 2 young children, received a phone call from the Tallahatchie County Sheriff's Department. The voice on the other end identified himself as Detective Lawrence Gibson. He was working cold cases, he explained. He'd been reviewing her mother's disappearance. He wondered if Clarissa might be willing to talk. Clarissa agreed immediately. They met 3 days later at a Cracker Barrel off Highway 278, neutral territory halfway between Tupelo and Glenwood. Detective Gibson was younger than Clarissa expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a way of listening that made her feel, for the first time in 18 years, that someone might actually believe her. They sat in a booth near the back. Clarissa ordered coffee she didn't drink, and then she talked. She talked for 4 hours. She told Detective Gibson about the morning her mother disappeared, about how, that evening when her father had been searching the house, calling for Clarissa, Clarissa had noticed something strange. Her father had been wearing different clothes than he'd worn that morning. In the morning, he'd worn khakis and his work shirt. But that evening, he'd been wearing jeans and a different shirt, a black t-shirt Clarissa had never seen before. When she'd asked him about it later, weeks later, the question finally forcing itself past her lips, he'd snapped at her, told her she was remembering wrong. She told Detective Gibson about the conversation she'd overheard 3 nights before her mother vanished, about her parents' arguments, about the way her father had seemed almost relieved in the days after Clarissa disappeared, once the initial shock wore off. Not happy exactly, but unburdened. She told him about her brother, Marcus Jr., who'd confided in her 2 years earlier during a drunken late-night phone call. Marcus Jr., now 24, had said something that still haunted Clarissa. He'd said, "I know Dad did it, I've always known. I just can't prove it." Clear's throat, Detective Gibson took notes. He recorded the conversation with Clarissa's permission. When she finished, he leaned back in the booth and studied her for a long moment. Then he said, "I believe you." Those 3 words changed everything. Detective Gibson reopened the investigation officially on April 10, 2018. He pulled every file, every photograph, every interview transcript from the original case. He brought in new technology, digital forensics, enhanced imaging, databases that hadn't existed in 2000. He tracked down everyone who'd been interviewed 18 years earlier and re-interviewed them with fresh eyes. He found the mail carrier, now retired, living in Oxford. The man remembered that day clearly, remembered seeing Clarissa's car in the driveway at 11:30, but also remembered something else. He'd driven past the Thompson house again around 1 o'clock, making a delivery to a neighbor down the road. And Clarissa's car had been gone. He'd mentioned this to deputies at the time, he said, but no one had seemed interested. It contradicted the timeline they were building. Detective Gibson pulled cellular tower records from June 14, 2000. In 2000, the technology had been primitive, but it existed. Marcus Thompson's phone had pinged off a tower near his workplace all morning. Then, at 12:34, it had pinged off a tower near Highway 32, exactly where the Texaco station was located. Then it had gone dark for 47 minutes. Then it had pinged back at the tower near his workplace at 1:26, 47 minutes. Plenty of time to drive home, to do something terrible, to drive back. On June 2, 2018, Detective Gibson brought Marcus Thompson in for questioning. Marcus was 60 years old now, his hair white, his body thickened with age. He worked at the same John Deere dealership, though he'd been demoted to parts clerk years earlier. He lived alone in a small apartment above a laundromat. He still attended church, though he'd switched to a small congregation in Charleston where no one knew his history. The interview took place in a small room at the sheriff's department, recorded on video. Detective Gibson was calm, methodical. He walked Marcus through the day his wife disappeared, asking the same questions that had been asked 18 years before. Marcus's answers were the same too, practiced, smooth. He'd been at work. He'd never left except for that brief trip to the Texaco, to the closed hardware store. He'd loved his wife. He had no idea what had happened to her. Then Detective Gibson pulled out the cellular records. He showed Marcus the tower pings, the 47-minute gap. He explained, in careful detail, how the phone had traveled from the dealership to the area near the Thompson home and back again. He asked Marcus to explain. Marcus said nothing for 43 seconds. The video recording captures him staring at the papers on the table, his jaw working, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. Then he said, "I want a lawyer." On August 14, 2018, the Tallahatchie County Grand Jury indicted Marcus Anthony Thompson on one count of first-degree murder in the death of Clarissa Mae Thompson. Despite the fact that her body had never been found, the district attorney believed they had enough circumstantial evidence to proceed to trial. The indictment cited the cell phone records, the conflicting witness statements, the suspicious timeline, and perhaps most damningly, new testimony from Marcus's own children. Marcus Jr. had finally agreed to speak on record. He told investigators about a conversation he'd had with his father in 2006, when Marcus Jr. was 12 years old. They'd been fishing at Tallahatchie River, the first and only time his father had taken him fishing after his mother's disappearance. Marcus Jr. had asked point blank, "Did you hurt Mom?" His father had stared at the water for a long time, so long that Marcus Jr. thought he wouldn't answer. Then he'd said, "Sometimes people make choices they can't take back. You'll understand when you're older." Marcus Jr. had interpreted that as a confession. The arrest made national news. CNN ran a segment. People magazine published an article. The story had everything. A missing woman, a cold case finally solved, a minister accused of murdering his wife. Producers from true crime podcasts called the sheriff's department requesting interviews. The community of Glenwood split predictably along old fault lines. Those who had always believed Marcus was innocent, and there were still many organized prayer vigils, held signs outside the courthouse proclaiming innocent until proven guilty. Those who had always suspected him nodded grimly and said they'd known all along, had felt it in their bones, had seen something in his eyes that night 18 years ago when he'd reported his wife missing. Mrs. Geneva Howard, the neighbor who'd waved to Clarissa that final morning, gave an interview to the Clarion Ledger. She said, "I always wondered. He seemed too calm, too controlled. Grief doesn't look like that. Grief is messy." The trial was scheduled for March 2019, but Marcus Thompson never made it to trial. On January 11, 2019, 2 months before proceedings were set to begin, Marcus's attorney arrived at the district attorney's office with a deal. Marcus Thompson would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for revealing the location of his wife's body. The DA agreed. On January 15, Marcus led investigators to a section of Tallahatchie County National Forest, 12 miles south of Glenwood. The area was dense with pine trees, undergrowth so thick it was nearly impassable. He directed them to a small clearing, marked only by a fallen oak tree covered in moss. He said, "She's here." Forensic anthropologists excavated the site over 3 days. They worked in careful grids, sifting soil through screens, photographing everything. 17 feet from the fallen oak, beneath 3 feet of earth and roots, they found human remains. A skeleton, partially collapsed, wrapped in a blue tarp that had mostly disintegrated. The remains were transported to the state crime lab in Jackson. DNA testing confirmed the identity: Clarissa Mae Thompson. The cause of death was determined by the medical examiner to be blunt force trauma to the skull. 3 distinct fractures, consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. Based on the pattern of the injuries, the examiner testified that Clarissa had likely been struck from behind, then struck again while on the ground. She would have died quickly. On February 8, 2019, in Tallahatchie County Circuit Court, Marcus Anthony Thompson stood before Judge Patricia Simmons and formally entered his plea. "Guilty," he said, his voice barely audible. Judge Simmons sentenced him to 35 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He would be 95 years old if he lived to see release. The courtroom was packed. Keisha sat in the front row, her husband beside her, her hands folded in her lap. Marcus Jr. sat 2 rows back, flanked by friends. When the sentence was read, neither of them reacted visibly. They simply sat, absorbing the words, the weight of 18 years of uncertainty finally lifting. Marcus Thompson was led from the courtroom in handcuffs. He did not look at his children as he passed. In the days following the sentencing, reporters camped outside the sheriff's department. Detective Gibson gave a press conference on the courthouse steps. He praised Keisha's courage in coming forward. He thanked the cold case unit, the forensic anthropologists, everyone who'd worked to bring justice for Clarissa Thompson. He said, "This case reminds us that time and silence can't protect the guilty forever. The truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried." Marcus Thompson never gave a full confession. He never explained why he'd killed his wife. The plea agreement required only that he reveal the location of her body, not his motive. Investigators speculated. Theories ranged from an affair to financial stress to something darker, more incomprehensible. But Marcus remained silent on the subject. He went to prison with his reasons locked inside him. Closing on June 14, 2019, exactly 19 years after Clarissa Mae Thompson disappeared, her family held a memorial service at New Hope Baptist Church. Her remains had been cremated, her ashes placed in a simple urn. The service was small, her sister from Memphis, her children, a handful of neighbors who'd never stopped believing she deserved justice. Pastor Williams, who'd known Clarissa since childhood, spoke about memory and loss and the long road to truth. Keisha spoke briefly, her voice steady. She said, "My mother was a quiet woman. She didn't ask for much. She loved her children. She believed in doing right. For almost 20 years, we didn't know where she was. We didn't know if she was suffering somewhere, if she was afraid, if she'd ever have peace. Now we know. And now she can rest." The case of Clarissa Mae Thompson is one of thousands of cold cases solved by advances in technology, by dogged investigators refusing to let go, and perhaps most importantly, by family members finding the courage to speak truths that could shatter everything they've known. Keisha and Marcus Jr. Thompson lived for 18 years in the shadow of their mother's disappearance, carrying suspicions they could barely voice, navigating a family structure built on lies. Their decision to speak first to each other, then to investigators, then in a courtroom, gave their mother the one thing that had been stolen from her: a voice. Marcus Thompson remains incarcerated at the Mississippi State Penitentiary in Parchman. He is 65 years old. He works in the prison library. He has requested no visitors. His children have not contacted him. Clarissa Mae Thompson's name was added to a memorial wall at the Tallahatchie County Courthouse, alongside other victims of violent crime. Her photograph, the same church directory picture that appeared on the news in 2000, hangs there still. If you visit Glenwood, drive past the house on County Road 19, you'll see a new family living there now. Children play in the yard. Flowers bloom in the garden where Clarissa once grew tomatoes and okra. Life continues as it always does, heedless and relentless. But somewhere in the pine forests of North Mississippi, marked now by a small granite stone placed by her daughter, Clarissa Thompson finally rests in the earth she knew so well. The delta that took her has given her back. And that, perhaps, is as close to justice as we can hope for in a world that too often forgets it's missing. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.